My name is Ken Otieno. I work with the Resource Conflict Institute as the Executive Director. And one of the things that we do as an organization, we do a lot of policy research advocacy, and majorly we will look at pastoralism, fisheries, agriculture, and forestry. I have had the opportunity to contribute to SPARC. I was one of the lead persons in the SPARC study, which was looking at the collective tenure, and we had a case study for Marsabit in Kenya. And I have a team who will join me here in a bit. I know one is still on the road, will be here in a short while. One of them was behind there, but he has chickened away, but it's okay. But for the ones who are here, I have Professor Oliver Wesonga from University of Nairobi, who is going to give an overall presentation in terms of just reflecting on customary tenure. I have Natasha Maru from the International Land Coalition, who is going to share with us around the land indicators. And then I have Dr. Jose Mario, who is also going to discuss with us on the framing of messages around pastoralism, particularly on customary tenure. We are not going to make this such a presentation PowerPoint based, but what we're going to do is we're going to have it as interactive and just see how we can collectively do something. And at the end of the day, at the end of it all, we'll see what comes out and how we can strengthen it. One particular presentation which will be interesting will be from Natasha, because her presentation builds or derives, is driven from the study based on what we found out in Kenya, Burkina Faso, and Sudan. And what the study basically was also framed in such a way that it was supposed to help in driving or developing customary tenure indicators or tenure indicators for pastoral land. So that is how it's going to be. But I think before we start, it would be important to try and understand what it was that we were looking at in this study. So one of the questions that we wanted to understand is that there are perceptions that customary tenure or pastoral land tenure rights can only be or might be more secure if they are given legal legitimacy. And that's a perception. So we wanted to understand that perception, whether it is true or not, by speaking to the pastoralists themselves. And secondly, we also wanted to understand what are some of the things that contribute or constitute tenure security for pastoralists. And we also wanted to test how confident they are with their land and statutory registration and when it is not registered. And the summary of it is that the feeling that communities have, particularly when it comes to registration, is that a number of them feel that, yes, it is good that we need to have our land registered, but this is only to help them negotiate, to help them comply with the law. But they feel that their tenure security is more assured, and the future and the passing over into the future is more certain when they use it and live with it collectively. And secondly, it was also important for them that when you think about customary tenure or their land tenure rights, it needs to be built on how their institutions are established, how they exist, if they are, grazing management institutions, how they work. So in sum, what was quite interesting is that tenure legality is more of what it is perceived to be for them than what actually they want to see. but then it's more about conformity rather than what they really want. So we also wanted to understand in doing this, what would you perceive to be or to define as a more secure pastoral, or what constitutes a functional pastoralist? And one of the things that was there is that it needs to be having and believing in the traditional systems and how they are practiced, and the leadership and the confidence, which is a bit dicey. But all these things constitute the need for us to continue the conversation in terms of, one, deepening our understanding, and two, demystifying the characterization of what really pastoralism is, but also what their tenure rights would be or should look like from our own lens, as opposed to what they are. So I would want to invite Professor Oliver to kind of give us a reflection based on what this conversation or what this discussion is going to entail, which is looking at a roadmap within the region. So, Prof.
I like this. Thank you very much, Ken. My name is Oliver Wasonga. I work at the University of Nairobi. I'm a rangeland ecologist. Yeah, I've been wondering why I was picked for this particular session, but I think it's basically because of my experience working in with the pastoralist communities in the region. Because it's been a long journey working with pastoralists, doing research, but also in training as well. And so for me, I've said I'm an ecologist, so I want to look at collective land tenure from ecological perspective, because then it's not all about rights. Because the question that will come up is collective land tenure for what? So I think we have to start from there to put this into context before we zero into other aspects that we're not supposed to delve into. So I just quickly prepared this just to help us think through. So I'm looking at collective land tenure as an enabler for resilience, because again, I wanted to put this into the context of the theme of this meeting. We've heard from various speakers how important herd mobility is. It is the tenet of a pastoral production system. And collective land tenure comes in to enable that flexibility, that pastoralists can track water and pasture wherever it is and wherever it is, whenever it is and wherever it is. So it enables that kind of flexibility. And the fact that mobility is possible, that is the reason why pastoralists can keep more livestock than what they would have kept if they were static. And so this basically raffles off the concept of carrying capacity. Through mobility, they are able to keep more than if the system was static. So many things happen. So many things happen when pastoralists move. I know we only know a few of them that are negative that do happen when pastoralists move, that they may end up fighting, there are conflicts here and there and so on. And there could be spread of livestock disease and so on. But so many things happen when they move, because through mobility, they are able to socialize with other communities. And through mobility, they can build stronger social alliances. They intermarry, they do trade. Those are social aspects. They also exchange breeds to help them improve their herds. So there are so many benefits that come with mobility. And this is all facilitated through common land tenure. But also ecologically, mobility allows the pastoralists to use their land in a more even way to spread the pressure and allow land that has been grazed to recover before they come back to graze. So these are the center, the collective land tenure and land mobility are at the center of resilience when we're talking about pastoral system. Of course, there are a host of other factors that work together to confer resilience for pastors in a pastoral system, but all these are considered key, with collective land tenure and land mobility being the most important. So I was asked to speak about competing land uses in our pastoral systems. But I added a stroke there to also bring out that element that they are not always competing, but they could also be common use in the sense that they could be complementary. So the key ones, the key competing or common land uses that you'll find in our pastoral areas are agriculture. Agriculture is not new in the pastoral systems, but it often takes up some of the critical grazing areas that are so dear to pastoralist communities during the dry or drought periods. So in that sense, they compete. There's tourism. Pastoralists have always coexisted with wildlife, but to an extent that certain areas are carved out and protected would definitely mean that is some element of competition coming in. Of course, we know presently that a number of communities in the region are running community-based community wildlife conservancies side by side with extensive livestock production. But of course, there's a lot of competing interests, a delicate balance between focusing on increasing productivity, livestock productivity, vis-a-vis conserving wildlife for other uses or purposes as well. And then there is urbanization that has fragmented the pastoral system. When you have settlements and infrastructure truncating rangeland ecosystems, then you cut off some very key components that make the rangelands whole for use for pastoralism. A very good example is where you're seated right now, which is supposed to be a dry season refuge for our neighboring pastoralist communities, and you'll still find them during dry season and drought periods coming over, because it's probably the only place that you'll always find water and some green grass. But of course, what it means is that it's already been taken away from them, so they have to keep on fighting and following, and probably sometimes venturing into other areas where they're not supposed to go. Energy and resource extraction is another one that competes with extensive livestock production, because through exploration and extraction, we may again encroach into some critical grazing areas, making them unavailable. And the key drivers to this are mainly the promise of economic returns, with the argument that you can get more per unit area when you engage in some of this high value, probably crop production compared to livestock production in the dryland. But of course, we all know, and this is only possible when we have the data to prove, to attach value to pastoral production. Population growth, of course, increasing demand for land resources and products. And this, in a way, also tends to favor intensification and, people trying out various activities in areas that are traditionally grazing land. Insecure land tenure that we are talking about here is another barrier, because in the absence of secure rights, then it becomes very difficult for the communities to be able to protect their land and to be able to access them when the resources, when they actually need them. And this ideally promotes land use change, leading to practices that may be not suitable for our rangelands. And then the policy development and paradigms, we are talking about a continuous and persistent priority being given to agriculture to an extent that when we are referring to food security, we basically talk about availability of maize, but not meat from the pastoral areas. So in essence, not really attaching appropriate and enough value to the rangeland resources as it's supposed to be. The consequences, of course, are well known, that all these activities restrict herd mobility, which is key for resilience in the pastoral areas. When we have a lot of pressure on these arid and semi-arid areas, you end up with soil degradation, loss of biodiversity, and you compromise the productivity of these lands, as well as eventually undermining the lives of pastoralists. And the marginalization of pastoralists, this has been there, but of course we want to always be positive. We no longer don't want to talk about that, but of course it's evident in terms of shifting political and economic landscapes that leave these communities with less influence over land use planning and resource management. So that's a big hurdle. But I want to end this by saying that I've been listening to the discussion that we've had from yesterday, and someone asked a very important question at the back. I can't remember who it was, whether what we are listening to or what we are hearing is actually new or not. Yeah, of course, these are the same things that we keep on hearing, the same narratives. But part of the things that should change is basically doing more of what we've already seen to be working, and trying to consolidate and evaluate what works so that we can also scale, because already there's a lot that's going on, but the narrative should ideally change from that of lamenting all the times, and probably move to the next stage of acting. Because the discourse now is going on in an environment where people are increasingly aware of the complexity in the arid and semi-arid ecosystems. And there are a lot of progress with regard to the policy and legal frameworks with regard to for pastoral production systems. And so we should take advantage of what is already going on. We should take advantage of this situation to advance our thinking, but also our actions going forward. So I didn't intend to prepare a presentation for this because I thought these are issues that probably would have just discussed without having to put them down, because there's more to say than to write. So I will end there and leave the rest for the discussions. Thank you. Okay.
Hello. Good afternoon, everybody. This is a very quiet room for this time. Thank you for the giggles. If any of you would like to come forward, that would be great as well. So I would invite you to come forward and use that as an excuse to move a little as well. Very good. All right, so my name is Natasha. I work as the global focal point for rangelands and pastoralists at the International Land Coalition. Many of you heard my presentation last morning, so I won't go into all the things that I already discussed last morning, but this is just to go a little bit more into the details of the land tenure indicators that we've been working on. I will recap a little bit for those of you who weren't there. But just quickly, I mean, we already know and heard how land tenure security is really important for pastoralists, both to protect against threats, but also to enable them to work better with their environments and with other land users in their environments. And we've also heard from Ken already that land tenure security is not necessarily enabled or enshrined through legal mechanisms. It's also in practice in the way that communities use and experience their land tenure security. So I will just speak a little bit about what we are doing through these indicators, what these indicators are, and what they can be used for. So just bear with me. Together with ODI, Printex, ILC, and supported by Spark, we're doing this work to develop indicators to monitor and assess land tenure security for pastoralists. So what do we mean by indicators really? Indicators are essentially questions or measures that you might ask to know the extent of land tenure security for pastoralists. And we know that, that this is not just a legal sort of safeguard, which is the de jure safeguard, but it's also in practice. There are ways in which land tenure is established and made secure through community practices, through customary institutions, and so on. And then there is also a perception of security. And this means that how far do pastoralists feel that their land tenure will be safeguarded in the future, or how much they feel that their current land use practices will be safeguarded also in the future. We'll get to this. This is just the beginning. What is the use of these land tenure indicators? And I spoke about this in detail yesterday, but for some of you who are not there, the land tenure indicators help to monitor and assess the extent of land tenure security. So many a times, including like in Kenya, for example, there are legal frameworks that give land rights to pastoralists. To what extent do these legal frameworks actually safeguard their land tenure? This is to be monitored and assessed. At the same time, there are many international frameworks, whether it's the SDGs, whether it's the CBD, or other such frameworks that have already recognized the centrality of land tenure security for land-based communities to work together with their environments. So these indicators help to collect data to also inform the achievement of commitments made within these huge frameworks as well. And at the same time, while this is a monitoring and assessment tool for governments to report on the work that they've done to secure land tenure. It's also a tool or an instrument that local communities and organizations working with them can use to advocate for land tenure security, to hold governments accountable to ensure land tenure security and so on. But this goes a little bit beyond as well. It's not only about having data on the land rights or land tenure security as it is. Sometimes, and we know it's true in pastoralist context, that legal frameworks or international understandings of land tenure or land rights are not commensurate with the ways in which pastoralists use and manage their lands, especially as Professor spoke about the collective use of land or herd mobility and so on. There are many conventions that don't incorporate these aspects. So when we have land tenure indicators that actually assess land tenure security also along these axes, also along these aspects, it also helps to understand the gaps or shortfalls of legal frameworks and conventions. And therefore, the data can be then meaningfully used to expand these legal frameworks. So this is the second sort of thing in which these indicators can be used. And then thirdly, the ways in which ILC and Prindex, Landex and Prindex, they work is that they work through people. And the data that they help generate is very grounded data, is citizen-driven data, and is people-centric land rights data. And so what this also means is that local communities on the ground are capacitated to not only advocate and hold accountable, but also collect meaningful data in ways that they feel is appropriate and use it in ways that they feel is appropriate. And this brings us back to conversations we've been having about co-production and, who are we doing this for and how do we address their needs and things like that. For most of you might also know that, for example, the Kenya Statistics Department will also take citizen-led and citizen-generated data and validate it and actually feed it in its reporting for the SDGs and things like that. And then maybe you might also know that there's, for example, the Sustainable Development Goal, which has a target for land tenure security. It's SDG 1.4.2. But this indicator actually sees land tenure security or land rights in a very private property way. So they, for example, think that countries should offer titles for land tenure security, which we know, for example, in pastoralist context, can bind and fix and privatize lands where we don't want them to be. So these are the sort of opportunities that indicators can create to shift away from these paradigms. This is the partnerships that we work through, Landex and Prindex. Just a little bit on the methodology. The methodology also worked together with communities to come up with these indicators. So there was a phase 1 of this project in which other colleagues were quite involved. Mickey is here. She was involved. Also other colleagues from ILRI, they were involved. And they did really intense sort of case study focus group discussions in Kenya, Sudan, and Burkina Faso to sort of draw out characteristics of well-functioning pastoralist tenure systems. So in context in which communities felt that their tenure is secure, what are the characteristics that show that their tenure is secure? And how do this is to identify what should be measured for tenure security. So that was phase 1, where we did 3 case studies very intensively. Phase 2, which was all of this year, was a more sort of process of globalizing what was found in the phase 1 to validate and globalize this stuff. So what we did is that we first brought together pastoralist organizations from across the world, many of whom are ILC members, and we sort of engaged them in a consultative process. We had a global plenary and then a questionnaire that they filled out to sort of list how their land tenure is working, detail out the sort of functioning of their land governance system. And from there, we drew characteristics that we could sort of lean on. And we did one-on-one interviews with several organizations to understand the context in which they work. And then we sort of narrowed down to 5 global indicators, and I'll come to them. We had validation workshops, and we will be launching soon in November. The next phase for this would be testing and implementation. So even though we might have land tenure indicators now to pilot, we need to understand how applicable they might be when they're actually used to collect national level data. And that's possible through a testing and piloting initiative. So this is just a quick timeline. Phase 1 was 2023 to 24. From 2024, we began to think through what the second phase would look like, and we launched it early this year. In March, there was a global plenary of all the sort of grassroots organizations that we brought together to be involved in this consultative process. April, May is when we did the questionnaire and the interviews. In June, we took the results of these questionnaires and interviews to the Global Land Forum in Colombia, and we had feedback from the pastoralist organizations that we had engaged. We also did it online for the organizations that were not engaged. We did several expert sort of feedback sessions and spoke to them about what they thought, academics, researchers, and also other sort of international development experts. I also facilitate the International Year Arrangements and Pastoralist Global Alliance Working Group on Land. This working group is full of experts and civil society representatives that work on the land rights issue. So we consulted with them, and now we're preparing to launch in November. So this is the sort of findings from our interviews and questionnaire. What we found is, well, we've already agreed that mobility is important, that collective land use and access is important. So what we know already about land tenure security is that it needs to enable the collective, overlapping, and temporal use and access of land. So this we know. So we aren't just necessarily assessing, oh, do pastoralists have collective use of land? That in itself is important to know. But we're also going deeper to understand that what is it that sustains this type of land use and access. So if we say that, collective, overlapping, and temporal use of land is important, what are the elements that sustain this, that enable this? And so the first element we found was formal rights. Many pastoralists feel that having formal recognition of their land rights or land tenure is important to enable them to use lands in which that are meaningful for them. The second aspect is social cohesion. So which means that the community needs to have a system of working together, needs to have some sort of governance arrangement, some sort of shared sense of belonging, identity, and all of those kinds of things that help them to use in these collective ways. Local rules and norms, that's self-evident, I mean, again, for this type of use. Relationship with other users. So if you're looking at like seasonal access to pastures, that might be farmlands, for example, or forest territories in many places. What is the relationship they have with other users? And these other users also include what they might consider neighbors, and therefore the informal sort of boundaries of their lands. And the last is perception, which is the extent to which they think or they believe their land tenure will remain secure 5 years from now. These are the sort of indicators that we have under the 3 categories of land tenure security. So the de jure tenure security, and I will come to each of these more specifically in the next slides, so you don't have to remember them just as yet. But for the de jure ones, we have formal recognition of rights, free, prior, and informed consent, extent of formal recognition, local and formal rules for access and use. The de facto, or the sort of land tenure in practice, is status and trend of social cohesion, status and trend of relationship with other land users, local norms and customary systems for access and use. And then obviously the perception of land tenure security is the likelihood of losing rights. And I'll come to each of these now. So for the first one, these are the indicators now. And the indicators obviously will have like different methodologies for collection of data. They'll have different sort of assumptions for what might be, what one might have to bear in mind as you go about collecting this data, how it might be disaggregated, what might be the possible responses and things like that. So what I'm showing you is like the sort of overview of the indicators, and we've spent the time to like detail these out, and that will be what will go into the report we're producing for November. So the first one, the de jure right, or the formal right, is primary land-related legislation contains provisions that recognize the right of pastoralists within the country or subnational region to their grazing areas or livestock corridors. And in this, when we say their grazing areas, we not only mean pastures or commons that they might access, but also grazing areas that they might use through reciprocity and negotiation and things like that, which might include, as I said, farming areas, agriculture areas or farming areas, forest areas, or other kinds of resource areas and commons, salt licks, for example, and then the livestock corridors or transhuman routes, as you might say. This indicator, the data for this indicator would be collected through two methods, and many of them are collected through two methods. Sorry, I think there's a problem in this slide. This one would be collected through one method, which is through expert review of legislation. But there are others that might also be collected through sample or survey. And then there's the disaggregation by whether the pastoralists are from the country or are from another country and moving into that country. I will go 5 minutes. Yeah, let me just read out the indicator questions. So the second question is primary land-related legislation contains provision that require free, prior, and informed consent of pastoralists before any laws, policies, or projects are approved that affect formally recognized pastoral grazing areas or livestock routes. This is about a consultative process in legislation formation. The third is proportion of adult pastoralists whose rights to access and use of grazing areas and livestock corridors are formally recognized. And then last of the formal rights is proportion of adult pastoralists who report that local formal rules for use of pastoral grazing areas and livestock corridors exist, meet the needs of pastoralists, are complied with, are enforced, and can be changed. For the social cohesion question, we have national level status and trend of social cohesion within pastoralist groups or communities. Here we want to know whether pastoralists perceive their social cohesion to be strong, moderate, or weak, and whether they feel that social cohesion is improving, not changing, or deteriorating. Similarly, with relationship with others, we want to know whether they feel that, their relationship is strong, moderate, or weak, improving, not changing, or deteriorating. There are 3 more. So local norms, again, similarly, you can read. And the last one is the threat of land loss, which is what we spoke about. The proportion of adult pastoralists who feel that they will lose their land, access to grazing areas and livestock corridors. And then we go into what might be the possible reasons why they feel that they might lose access to land. And we do a sort of mapping. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we looked at 2 things. One was to look at the land uses, tenure security, and existing policy and legislative frameworks with region Now we want to look at how we can then build a roadmap towards that. And I invite all my panelists to step up to the podium. Otherwise, Professor looks so alone there.
Yeah.
Alan, you can join the team. I don't know why we are very far away from you in the end. Thank you. So I have two of my panelists who are not there, and we were doing the introduction. And Tasha, you pick your pieces from there. So I have two of my colleagues who are not there, and the rest are being introduced. And start with Alan Akibaga, a colleague, and he's going to also reflect on a few thoughts around the question of tenure. And it's a household name. Maybe many people have read the name, but probably I cannot see, but she's going to talk, so we have the opportunity. So the first round of reflection for me to all the panelists would be generally the question around we are looking at the region, and there are a lot of things that are happening in the region. The two perspectives from Natasha's tenure indicators and from Sullivan's roadmap and thoughts. What do you find most intriguing that keeps undermining the question of customary tenure or pastoral tenure rights in the region? And there are a number of things that you reflect on, but what comes to your mind when you get this? Because there are two things that Natasha is talking about, factually. So I think we can start from the left.
Yes, thank you so much, Karen, for. As Ken said, my name is Alan Akibaga. I work with Ken as the head of policy and advocacy, and also I am an advocate of the High Court of Kenya. To the question that Ken has asked, I think there are numerous issues which, from my perspective, and having had the first-hand experience of how these communities reason, there are agitations, even in the dispensation of us encouraging them to register their land and also fight for the maintenance of the customer tenure system. I think one of the issues that comes up strongly that leads to us making it difficult for this collective land tenure to be maintained. One of them is more to do with climate change issues globally. And I decided to start by studying the overall issue, climate change, because it's from climate change that now other key issues emanate from, issues such as now the need for livelihood diversification. Because we find that now, as climate change is affecting the livelihood of these pastoralists, causing some of them to lose their livestock. They reach to a position whereby they want to try other things. So you find some of them now want to venture into livelihood systems like agriculture. And what does agriculture entail? It entails them trying to, of course, secure some piece of land where now we can be able to maybe either engage in irrigation or whatever. There's something to heal from the vagaries of climate change that has cost them a lot within the context of keeping livestock. So this is one, and apart from that, of course, we are also experiencing a situation whereby, without pointing fingers, anyway, of course, the World Bank has been insisting on the need since time immemorial for structural and industry program, and this comes in with the need for privatization. So, unfortunately, our youth, the elite currently, they have grown up realizing that we need to privatize it since we need to get loans from the banks to do other development measures. And so we realize that in some of these communities, we are having that pressure. And when you go to communities like Kajiado, let's say here in Kenya, whereby they have been registering, transitioning from group ranches to community land. Immediately transition, they proceed subdivision, and this subdivision is posed by these items. I need my land to go and secure a loan from the bank. I need my land to do irrigation. I need my land. I mean, so that I feel I'm really benefiting from it. So these are just among the issues that are so bad.
So, okay, my name is Hussein. I'm from Pastoral and from Organization Center for Research and Development in Drylands. We are local and governmental organization. Ken, when reflecting on asked about what undermines general rights, a strange question came to mind. Like, when was the first general rights registered ever? In the world, and in what context? And in that sense also, why is general rights issues for pastoralists and common land still something new and something that we struggle with? And to pick up from there, what I will say is one underlying thing that still affects general rights for pastoralists is based on how pastoralism is perceived, how the land use, using mobility itself is perceived. And what I can say is, when we talk about general rights from its origin, is this fixation with having borders, having a certain piece of land that can be transacted on the market, that can be taxed. And this is what people are also used to before even talking about communal general rights. So when we talk about this communal general rights, and when we look at pastoral land use, which is mobility, flexibility, so moving from, or applying the fixed mindset to this flexible use of land becomes a bit paradoxical. Adopting that to this becomes paradoxical. And for pastoralists, access to land is land that does not necessarily be yours, is where you also want to have access to. And when you look at the origin of general rights, when the borders are drawn, you are supposed to stick on to this side. And this affects also how general rights ascertainment is conceived. And as an example, in Kenya, and from northern Kenya, where I come from, there's a lot of effort trying to register community land. And one of the things that people talk about is, or if you ask them why this land has to be registered, or what happens if it's registered, they'll say, oh, we'll be able to keep out these people, having this, or we would like to claim, some ancestral or lost general rights, perceived general rights that they have. So these are some of the things that I think also in the background still impacts how general rights are secured. But then on the other hand, here you are as communities. You have owned this land from the time that you can identify yourself as a community. When this, whatever we call form of governments were not there. Then the governments happen, and they are the ones to bring regulations or what we call legal frameworks that you need to comply with for that entity to recognize that land as yours. And this is also the other element, like people naturally know that they own this land. So this process of them, kind of proving to the government that this is their land and following some set processes which is strange to them also, for me, is something that is difficult for communities and it describes or rather undermines how tenure is registered.
So,
Yes, yes.
thank you. I think you bringing in an aspect which probably we might have to tell as much as possible passed on the baton to you. This now brings in, the role of legal framework. Because saying that there is this notion where we're moving for flexibility, some kind of compartmentalized system that is driven by the existence of policy demands. And I mean, from your experience, locally, regionally, what do you have to say?
Thank you. And nice to be here. My name is Rusna Mark. I work for FAO Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, and my area of focus actually is on non-tenure. And thank you for the presenters in terms of working on this. And bringing the policy aspects, before anything, we look at the intent of it. The intent of policies, legal framework, even institutional frameworks around land tenure should be able to be from practice to law, and vice versa, meaning that it should be a continuous and a flexible process where it keeps on being, reviewed now and then. In a case of where Dr. Olio was talking about in terms of Kenya, it should be the other way, actually. And why I say it should be the other way, because for Kenya, I think they recognized customary tenure for the first time when they were enacting the 2010 constitution. And that was quite a big milestone. But what happens after that is something different, because we all know that for a long time, not only in Kenya, in the region, we've really concentrated, and I don't want to be quoted, on high potential areas in terms of crop production. And forgetting that there is the pastoralism in the other hand, which is the bigger chunk of the many of the countries in this region. So the aspects of customary tenure accepted or recognized in policy frameworks is first to recognize that they live and there is such a land use in this country. They live such a community and there is such a land use in the country. How it was conceptualized now further in terms of bringing the acts and the various regulations is something which we need to go back to the drawing table to be able now to identify and be able to recognize that there's the aspects of mobility here. And I agree with what Shane was saying in terms of when we talk of registration of land, we talk of, let me have my piece, let me have my title, and I will put a fence around it. That already doesn't work in terms of pastoralism. So that recognition needs to now be recognized in the sense that we all know that such and such a community needs to be living at this time of the year to be able to move to this other area. And this is where now the aspects of recognizing and protecting these areas is very, very key. And one of the other things in terms of the intent of the law is, if you look at even what Kenya identified with in terms of the principles, recognize, protect, and register. For me, if I was going to draw the regulations after that, I will look at the aspects of mobility and be able to put up proper laws and proper bylaws to be able to protect that ecosystem, and then the aspects of registration comes. When we say that we put proper bylaws, that means you will be able to allow or advise in terms of ensuring that there is acceptance of that mobility, and then be able to recognize all the interested parties, communities who who has interest on that particular land. And I think for me, if that happens, and if people can be able to really reflect back, including the communities in terms of their own undocumented or unwritten rules, they will tell you such and such a community passes here during this period of time. So for me, I think there's a little bit of not only misconception or understanding in terms of how we need to look at, especially the collective tenure or customary tenure in our effect. And then I think also in terms of this is the time when we say when recognition of customary tenure is there, it doesn't mean it has to go with the ideology of the high potential area. This should be recognized in that sense, but also very importantly, it's an opportunity for the pastoralists, for the communities to be able now to put it in writing, to document their way of life and be able for it to be captured in law. Thank you.
I think
from what you are saying, the last slide, when Professor Oliver was making his presentation, trying to frame the question of the different types of pieces, and then there were a whole lot of different existing laws and policies. My question was then going to be on taking it over from there. Alan has given us the experience in the southern range in terms of how the evolution, moving from good ranches to now with registration, and then it is all into privatization. Then the same. Now, Costa is bringing in the aspect of the three principles: protection, recognition, and registration. So for me, the question then would be, how do you then deal with this in terms of land use changes and land use patterns in within the collectives?
Mine?
Just hold the mic, but Natasha wants to add something. So as she adds that, you plug in. You are adding something on both.
Maybe it comes at the intersection of what Husna is saying and what you're asking, right? Because and I think we need to unpack what we're talking about here in terms of that. Where I work, I have worked for a long time in India with pastoralists. These pastoralists are 8 months of the year in farmland. So they are grazing farm residues for 8 months of the year. Which is the majority. It's only the rainy months that when the crops are growing that they are not in farmlands. And so here what happens? What do the pastoralists need? The pastoralists need fodder, and the farm residues offer fodder. What do the farmers need? The farmers need crops. When the crops grow in the monsoon months, they are harvested. The farmer has his income from the harvest, right? So the land or the earth itself is not what they're seeking in these situations. They are seeking what the earth can give you, right? Which is grass, water, crop, whatever else. So when does this earth become important? When do you start fencing or claiming that land, right? And what logic is enabling that claiming? There is a whole logic of land commodification, the tracking and taxing of land that governments want to do, the sort of assetification of land, where land has become an asset, a collateral, a financial instrument, right? So it's not serving the basic needs or subsistence needs of land-based communities. It's for this kind of marketing of land, where land rights become important. So when we're also talking about laws, or we're talking about safeguarding land, we need to unpack what is it that we are safeguarding. You might have heard of this concept of the bundle of rights, where you have use, access, management, exclusion, irrigation, all of these different aspects. And what we end up doing is when we talk about land rights or land laws, we always talk about all these together. So when we're talking about safeguarding land tenure, even collective land tenure, we are saying that all these must remain with that collective. But in fact, when you unpack this bundle of rights and really go into the detail of the sticks, what are the different aspects of land tenure that each user needs, and begin to design systems, frameworks, laws around those particular needs of land, then you might be able to have land use laws, frameworks, and arrangements on the ground that actually enhance the reciprocity, the negotiation, and the organic ways in which different people use land.
Thank you. I think Natasha has already answered the question that I was supposed to, but I would attempt to respond on the use vis-a-vis the collective land. I mean, on the competing use vis-a-vis the collective land tenure this way. I think one of the things that makes it extremely difficult to really operationalize if we have the policy and legal framework in place to operationalize the collective land tenure is because of competing interests. We could be having laws, we could be having the policies in place, but they are competing interests, like the ones that I did highlight. And also, of course, just building on what Natasha has said, whether when you define these rights, they are rights, ownership rights, or access rights that could also be seasonal, that they don't have to be permanent or not. One of the competing land uses that really sometimes is a lot of debate about in the regulations is the wildlife conservation, for example. And when we talk about having a collective land tenure, then one would quickly ask, how do you reconcile these two? That you want to conserve wildlife, and here is a scenario where, for our case in Kenya, we talk about community land, and of course, their interest would of course what will come first would be the livestock. And the government also has a stake in the conservation of the wildlife. So that also brings us to the dual aspect of application of customary laws and statutory laws in the pastoral areas, where you draw the line, because you have to deal with these two together. When you talk of something that is legal, and when you talk about what do you call it, legitimacy. So these two things. So and I think this is not new in pastoral systems, that the statutory rules and the customary ones always go together, and they are applied somehow, for lack of a better word, in a confused way. They are always applied and somehow they work. But now when you want to really have a legally registered land under community, how do they operate? I'll just give you a case for southern Ethiopia, where the government is trying to formalize the community land certification process that is going on there. If you talk to the pastoralist communities there, they say that may not actually even stop the individualization of land in the area, but they know it will lead to more secure rights. But they also worry about the scale at which this is being implemented. Would it be implemented at Wareda level or Kebele? Would it be implemented at Deda level or RERA? So there is a government, administrative levels, and there's also the community levels that are also parallel to this. So this brings a lot of confusion. I know I'm only supposed to answer questions. But I may want to ask also something at the end. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we've heard from this end. Maybe there could be reactions to what has been said. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, it's nothing. It's great. We'll have to start from there.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I'm Ms. Daly. I'm the Gender Equity and Social Inclusion Advisor for Spark. But I've also been working on land tenure for about 30 years. So wanted to thank all the panel and the speakers. I found this very interesting conversation. I think it's more of a comment than a question, although it'd be good to get some of your reflections on this. Some things that I haven't heard that I wanted to hear in this discussion. So specifically about power relations. It's been touched on a little bit, particularly in the last comments from the professor. We talk a lot about collective tenure and protecting rights of communities. And this goes beyond pastoralism, not just within pastoralism, but within those communities. Who's making the decisions? The community could have strong collective rights. They can be supported in different legal frameworks. There could be movement corridors, all those kind of things. But within the communities, whose rights are strong and who's are weak and who's vulnerable? And how do the more vulnerable people in the communities get included in the decision-making processes about how the land is used, about how the tenure rights that the community has are allocated to the community. So those kind of power dynamics, I think they're very complex, and so oftentimes we can sort of shy away from addressing them because they're so complicated. But we also, if we don't raise them at the top level within all the the policy frameworks, then there's no scope for trying to address them from the bottom up. The other one that I didn't hear about, which I also wanted to hear, is about the social meaning of land, the emotional meaning of land. It's not just whether we need to be able to take our livestock, but it's what does this place mean to us? I'm coming from Australia, and our Indigenous communities in Australia have a very, very strong sense of country. And that was ripped away from them during colonization, and we are still in the middle of ongoing debates about Indigenous land rights in Australia. But one of the strongest things that features in that debate is talking about the actual meaning of the land to people, not just what it's for, what its economic use, whether it's going to be the side of a road or the side of a farm or a mine, but what the land means when it tells stories that go down the generations. And I think that's often the case in different Indigenous communities, including many pastoral communities.
Please, thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
Charles is behind you. Charles is behind you. Yes. Let's try get them short so that we can get as many.
Thank you, moderator. Thank you. My name is Charles Kagema. I work for the National Commission in Kenya. I want to begin by saying those presentations were super, and the next we go to the panelists quite informative. Maybe I begin from where I can clarify. The issue of land tenure is almost now everything. However, this, like you said, land tenure is about perception. And actually, the problem we have that now it is catching up with the community, not only in the rural areas, even in urban areas. You'll find people are now looking at, how you access the strategy and how you access any piece of land. It's about people around there. Do they recognize that you have a right to access that? It's not about your documentation about it. But tenants need to be, you need to think about more and try to first of all, not really connected with the IGAD, the law and so forth. Now, I think beginning with what Professor has taken us through, that was very interesting. But I want to ask one or two questions around that. You actually brought about what we are calling those competing references. But I want to ask, are they not really competitive? Are they not really competing? You know, those land uses themselves from an economic return point of view. Is it not true that they are competitive compared to this other thing? Because until we are able to convince ourselves and the communities that we are not talking about the economic return, so that we begin looking at the sustainability of that, what the use that we have there. Because you see, pastoralism is not only the most viable economic activity out there, but it is also the most sustainable. I don't know, when we talk about sustainability, we talk about the very many complex issues that the human being may not be able to control. So the way to go is pastoralism. So my question is, really, since that is the reality, and remember there is a lot of dynamism within, even among the communities out there. How do we bring out that understanding, even among the young generation, the new generation, that this is not only looking at it from an economic. Now, you also brought about the issue of marginalization of the communities when we are doing that use land. And I wanted to hear more, a little bit more on that, because you know the way what we are emphasizing is that participatory plan. And that is in, then we are involving the community. We would like to know exactly where then are we getting it wrong. However, I do know that sometimes communities are sort of prevented from coming forward by their own leaders and the areas around it. And we end up seeing a situation where they are really marginalized.
Thank you.
But then exactly where are we? Now, Natasha, thank you very much for that explanation. Again, indicators of reality. But I wanted
Charles, make it a bit shorter.
to find you have contribution into the paradox of pastoralists. Do we register? We formalize this ownership or not? Which will they go? Because you see, if you formalize, you know what happens. Like we have already been told, fragmentation will show. But then, how do you secure these lands? Those displacement and all those kind of things are going through the same laws that we are enacting. And I'm talking about the situation and the scenario. Thank you very much. Because I remember, thank you very much, Madam Wisner. You see, we must be careful. What applies in the so high productive or high potential areas? That's never not applying.
Thanks, Charles. We'll come back. We'll come back. Let me have Eric. Eric is there. Fortunately, I know most of you, so.
Thank you very much. You see the energy passion people have. So my name is Eric Kumolo, PhD student, candidate at the University of my question is about the policy provisions and the progress that can be made. For example, you've been able to see the whatever is there, and also the indication that the constitution can be very progress this. I think what I'm not getting is whether we are able to indicate that we've been able to make certain progress with those policy provisions or legal documents. Have they been able to give us any progress in terms of building sustainable planting systems that are out? And what are those specific progress? Maybe it's something that I don't say straight, but what are those specific progress that we've been able to realize? I don't exactly we have, because if you're talking about your example, that should be a question of what is it, what progress have we made with this, and then what is it that is new that we need to look at. Taking care of this new dynamics, for example, mentioned the question of climate change and other underlying issues. Maybe the question of whether the competing interest of the competing or complementary costs. I would just want to hear if that is available, if really we can be able to indicate any progress. Okay, we will be able to the policy issues.
Thank you, Eric. Then there was one hand here.
So, thank you. So my name is John, supporting an organization called Media Knowledge. And given that the collective that system remains the cornerstone of pastoralists, pastoral life, supporting consumers and seasonal mobility across now the frontier credits. How can these systems survive in the face of accelerating pressures such as Islam session, facing the chance of lands, especially in Laikipia, there are some parts of the counties in Kenya. And in the light of these challenges, we believe the future of pastoralism is assured to be efficient, or is it at the risk of being eroded?
Thank you, Joe. Let me get Raphael last, and then we can react to.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ken. You actually asked a very good question that what should be done in this situation where there are commons and there are other emerging land uses, which, as Professor Oliver put it, some of them are complementary. My view is that, and this is my suggestion, it would be a radical suggestion, that this question should be taken back to the commons themselves to respond to. We could be struggling here to give responses, but I think the best responses come from them, because they are best placed to explain to us why they have ever held that land as commons. And one of the describing factor is mobility that the presenters have just talked about. And when part of this discussion was brought the county level, I come from Turkana County, Kenya. It became very complicated until we resolved that if we have to move ahead in terms of recognition and protection of Turkana County as a land of commons, then the first step in recognition is to give us one title deed as a county. And then everything else that happens within that land or county of commons, first has to recognize that whether they are private, whether they are public, they are within commons. And therefore, the first right that has to be protected is the right of commons. After that, we can sit down now and negotiate. How can those other small interests, public, private, be protected within commons?
Thank you very much, Raphael. I only have 5 minutes, and I had my last question to the panelists, because I had my one last question to them, and there are 3 or 4 questions that have come from the audience, 2 specifically from Charles, Eric. I think the one of Eric one is very easy. Alan is going to deal with that. But basically, the last question I wanted to put across to the panelists as you try answering this question, the questions that are there, is I think, and Joe is raising something which is very interesting, that where is the future of pastoralists or pastoralism? But I think the answer depending on how this is going to be responded to. For me, there are opportunities. One of the opportunities that are there is that there is greater recognition of pastoralists and rangelands locally, regionally, and globally. Therefore, as you respond to any of the questions that you might want to respond to, please also tell us how do we frame the messaging? Because when I listen to what Dr. Raphael is talking about is, let's take it back to the people. Eric is saying that, yes, we might have made, a lot of progress, but we are not yet there. Are we there or not? I think what Liz is saying is that let's all understand the inclusion question. And then Charles is wondering the planning and the dynamics around planning and how do we reconcile, what we may perceive as competitive or being comparative and complementary. So how do we frame the conversation? How do we frame, the debate so that we see that we are answering all these questions in a manner that we are also not making decisions for and on behalf of people, but we are framing the debate so that this debate is well structured, is well anchored, both in law, practice, and in pastoral. Thank you. Prof.
So I don't know where to start. Should I respond to pick one of the questions from the floor and respond to it?
Yes.
Is that okay?
Yes, that will be fine. And then as you wind up.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let me pick the one that impressed me most. I will skip the one on the future, so that at least you said something. But I'm tempted also to say that pastoral production, just like any other system, just like agriculture, is quite dynamic, it's not static. So we are likely to see a different form of pastoralism, maybe 20 or 30 years to come. And depending whether we put in place these measures we're talking about or not, I'm very sure it will persist, but probably in different forms. That's a quick one on that. About the competing land uses, whether some of them are really competitive. I think this debate basically arises from one of the biggest challenges that we may not, quite often may not have adequate data or evidence to back to show value of the pastoralism. Wherever we have this, we have piecemeal and scanty data here and there. And whenever our governments take stock of what they would call value, they base it on the residual value from economic terms. The value of the livestock that is in the market is a residual value because this animal is consumed before it gets to market. So this pastoral system.
Thank you.
I wasn't asking me to talk about future of pastoralism, but I will not want to do that. I think I'll just gloss over some of the questions based on what we hear also from the people on the ground, and especially when it comes to these laws, these policy frameworks come up with institutional settings, that involves electing or selecting people to represent communities. How this happens, and even how to get the information about the law itself, it marginalizes some people. People in towns, people who are able to read and write, they're the ones who take this center stage. So we hear people saying, oh, this is already becoming an elite kind of an issue. People who are talking about this, driving this people in towns. And we have seen elections happening for community land management committees, for example, in Kenya, where individuals who are interested hire lawyers, move people from one point to another to get elected. So those are some of the things. And then in terms of the social meaning for land, I think this is quite common with what you say about Australia and areas. With pastoralists, for example, one common thing that I would say is where my umbilical cord was buried, you know, and even if it is miles and miles away from where you live currently, you still consider that as part, that attachment is still there. And for instance, when the Rendile community and Samburu, Tukanas went to court against the Tukana Wimpa, one of the points was there's this ceremony that happens there every 14 years that actually a lot of people don't really see it as something important happening. So these are some of the connections that are there. Definitely, what people say is the kind of identity that they have goes with the land. So if these two are taken apart, then socially, then you are not kind of a complete person.
Okay, we are 2 minutes.
Oh, yes. But complementing is basically about this value of land. And I want to reiterate what I said because if you don't value pastoral, I mean, we don't really value pastoralism in our area. So anything that comes up as a sort of not providing some convenience is seen as the right thing to do. But what we say is if a complementary, if coexisting, you know, land uses can be implemented in pastoralism, then it's a positive way for the people to get additional income. So I think also the interest of time.
Thank you. Oster, 1 minute.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, indeed, I'll just say yes, there is quite opportunities that I can say in terms of the future of pastoralism. Probably what we need to look at, just the way we look at the other aspects of climate smart agriculture in that sense, then this is also something else needs to be looked into in terms of how can we make it better within the aspects or recognizing the aspects of the competition with land population increase and all that, all those issues. And most importantly, when we sorry again, he's also whispering something on
Okay, next time I will not put you together, please.
Thank you. One thing, if we talk of aspects of security, and I think we need to really start refreshing or change our narrative. Because when you look at security of tenure, we're not looking at ownership and ownership only. There's a big aspects of access and use. And I think this is what earlier I talked of in terms of when we are registering land for such a community, there has to be a caveat in terms of there is a community which passes here. There are pastoralists who passes here at this time of the year, which needs to be recognized. So it's a whole complex of understanding and ensuring that policy captures that, and not only policy captures that, but also the institutions who have the duty to ensure those rights are provided, really understand that. And then most importantly, for me, for the question of our progress in Kenya, there is quite some progress. What I mentioned earlier, for me, a little bit of review because there are so much emerging issues which are coming out. A student from University of Nairobi, I'm trying to respond to your question.
Eric,
yeah, we want to listen to this. There is a lot of progress in terms of community land tenure, for example, in Kenya, after that recognition. But what is important is the review to look at the emerging issues. We are talking of mobility now. Was that really captured? And that is why I said there has to be a caveat or a disclaimer. And especially if you are going to secure tenure, by all means, to registration and ownership of those communities to be able to ensure that one of the emerging issues is captured. One more thing, Ken, and I'm so sorry for this. I think in terms of marginalization, within communities themselves, but also, can I call it the complexity within the duty bearer and the right holder thing? We might want to look at the examples or the issues which are happening currently in Uganda, for example, or the Balalo community, but also the Loliondo community in Tanzania. And then now probably you can feature the aspects of marginalization in terms of not only eviction, in terms of only moving people to other areas, but the whole aspects of within themselves, but also what the duty bearer is doing. Thank you.
I will be quick. I will respond to something that Charles brought up and Liz brought up. So Charles brought up something about the paradox of registration and paradox. So when we were developing these indicators, there is an indicator on the proportion of pastoralists, so proportion of population with secure land tenure. There was a question of whether we should do proportion of population or percentage of area. And oftentimes what happens is that land tenure is secured or enshrined within the land territory. There is a direct mapping of tenure rights to territory. And we felt that for pastoral context, the right needs to be enshrined within the person and to allow for that ambiguity, flexibility, mobility, and all of these things, right? We didn't necessarily want to tie it to a percentage of land because we know there are multiple users and we know that the land shifts and so on, right? And so it's not this direct relation. And that's part of shifting that paradox. Where is the right enshrined? And this is also why we brought it back to these aspects of social cohesion, of local rules and norms, of relationships with other users.
Thank you, Natasha.
This responds also to this. So secure land tenure is a means, it's not the end. Inclusive governance is the end. But through these sort of indicators mapping, and it feeds into each other, right? So you see gaps in where social cohesion is. You see gaps in governance systems and things like that, and try to improve.
Thank you, Natasha. Thank you. Alan, 1 minute, please. At least. Yes.
Yes, thank you so much. I want to respond to Eric, but I think Husna has done justice to that last question. The only dilemma I have with that situation is that we are already talking about review, yet we have not implemented fully the very long we want to review. So maybe it's urge the practitioners, especially from the government side, to ensure that we work together to fully implement that community land act within the context of Kenya. And also continue encouraging land exchanges across maybe regionally so that we can see how other pastoralists are also going the way of life. This one I think will help us to properly frame the future of pastoralism through the land exchanges. And especially when it comes to review, I think one key thing that Kenya needs to do is to put a moratorium to land subdivision once these communities get the certificate of registration. I think that will help us to keep away the elites from registering this community land with an internet goal in mind. So I think that will probably. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys. I think this has been quite interesting. So for me, just to go back to the original focus, which was thinking regional roadmap, I'll only leave the audience with the 3 areas to think as we reflect on the regional mobility and regional collectives. That one of the things that probably we might want to think about in terms of regional roadmap is a landscape-based planning. I think what Charles was saying is about planning, but then can we think about it from a regional perspective? Number 2 is, indeed, there is progress made in policy, but the operationalization of these policies is quite important, and particularly regional instruments. I think we need to work. Member states must take up responsibility. And lastly, there's still a conversation on the value of rangelands and the different systems that support it. Mobility is key to them. So as we think through this, I think it is important for us to think about the value, but more importantly, think of the enablers, and the enabler, one of them being mobility. So to my panelists, thank you so much. I think you've done a splendid job, and I wish you the very best. To the audience, thanks for listening. And guys, sorry, I've short my time by 7 minutes, sorry.